Most people know that Baltimore is the birthplace of the national anthem, but are clueless of the abundance of architectural history it offers. Its buildings and streets are abound with history to share with those who are willing to look. The main focus of this project is the Gothic Revival architecture in Baltimore, trying to understand its origins and stylistic prevalence within the city. Our journey began with a conversation with two professors of history at Loyola University. Images came to life from the readings, and forms that were familiar sprouted from the ground up. From the well-adorned spires, the pointed arches of its doors, and the projecting exterior support, it is a nod towards the foundation of Gothic architecture and its revival of the late 1800s. Even the building that the interview was held had protruding jetties on its upper floors with fachwerk, a form of building where the timber frame is shown through the construction, reminiscent of classic medieval houses.
Kind of. Well, I was born and raised in the States in the West, and did my graduate school at the University of Toronto, and was hired here after a few years of teaching agencies. In fact, Jack was one of the ones who hired me 28 years ago, believe it or not.
Dr. Kelly DeVries is an academic historian, a well-published author, and a commentator on many History Channel documentaries relating to medieval warfare. Dr. Bryan received his bachelor's from Princeton and his PhD in history from University of Cambridge. He has worked at Loyola for about 40 years and has helped develop programs and courses for the university where the Middle Ages has been a hallmark.
One thing you have especially in any construction, and this goes for the Middle Ages or it goes for 19th century Gothic revival in the United States, and that is that you have to have wealth. And these things are not cheap.
With such grand structures, such as the Mount Vernon Place United Methodist Church, built in 1872, it shows the wealth of Baltimore to build these churches. As much as religion played a role in the creation of Gothic revival architecture during the 18th and 19th century, one cannot deny that money also played a role in the creation of these works. This is to be expected, of course, as the creation of a Gothic-style cathedral or castle is not something that is going to be cheap.
To get the big Gothic revival churches, you're going to have some money behind it. And consequently, you see churches most often in Europe in the Middle Ages in the major cities. And some of the major cities that are Industrial Revolution don't have them. But the major cities that would have been trade in the Middle Ages or industry will have them, and have maybe one or two or some even more.
So, it should come as no surprise that the larger works of Gothic architecture are mainly found in the major cities in Europe, as well as in the United States, where larger cities like Boston, New York, Baltimore, and Philadelphia all have large Gothic cathedrals. Historically speaking, this makes sense, as large centers of culture and population were usually on the forefront of artistic development, and these were the places that people went to go see great works of architecture. Cathedrals weren't the only example of Gothic architectures that were displays of how much money the commissioners were able to pay. Upper-class gentlemen would also have small Gothic castles, called follies, built for their own enjoyment and for the purpose of showing off how much money they had, which during the interview Dr. Kelly DeVries mentioned how strange it was for Greenmount Cemetery to have such a grand entrance.
Entry to the Greenmount Cemetery is that essentially they're building this folly to give it, because it's traditional, but it's a big castle and everything else. It's supposed to give grandeur and importance on a smaller scale.
Gothic architecture is a staple of the medieval era. It is a quintessential part of the landscape of the European city, originating during or even before medieval times. It developed out of a necessity for height, a necessity that was not being met with current architectural practices. The Roman arch, while allowing for some height, did not meet the criteria for which the medieval style would eventually become known for. A style known as Perpendicular Gothic is one of the most advanced of these practices. The medieval era developed the pointed arch that allowed for better weight distribution of the stones that made it up, allowing for the building to reach for the heavens. Flying buttresses, which come off the tall buildings like wings, could redistribute the weight that the arches could not hold beyond a certain height. Thus, medieval buildings soared towards the sky. They dominated the landscape they existed within, over the city roofs and store shops below. Their support and ability to grow taller allowed for the use of the stained glass, sometimes painted and sometimes mixed with the ground metals or gems, to tell the stories of the Bible for those who could not read. Lux nova, or building with light, allowed for the color to fill the large stone interiors of the cathedrals. When one entered the space created, held up seemingly by nothing other than light from the heavens, it was awe-inspiring. Gothic revivalism in the Americas came out of a reaction towards the neoclassical architecture that had become revitalized following the French Revolution in 1789. Its spires, stone fixtures, and sculptural aspects stood in contrast to the strict, straight-lined, classically inspired architecture that dominates Washington, D.C. to this day. Baltimore is filled with Gothic-style churches and public spaces that pop on a corner one does not expect, or in between buildings built well into the 1900s. The need to go high might not have existed in America in the 1870s when Gothic revivalism was introduced, but architects who had studied in Europe brought these buildings that still loom and dominate the space they exist within, bringing over a tradition of buildings that began far before America was ever a country. After an hour-long conversation with both Dr. DeVries and Dr. Bryan, the questions surrounding Baltimore as a city home to Gothic revival were finally answered. Although Baltimore was already an established city by the 19th century, there was still a real estate market at the time that allowed for Gothic construction. The churches were easy to fit into the plots of land at perpendicular angles, such as square plots. Being fairly narrow and built high, not wide, the infrastructures erected in the Gothic style did not need city planning involvement. Dr. Bryan elaborated on the topic by stating,
"The fascinating series of inventions that allowed them to build these cathedrals in the Middle Ages. By 19th century America, large buildings could be built for all kinds of purposes. Railway, terminals, Erie Canal. U.S. Capitol is a gigantic building, considering the size of the country when it was built. So the choice of Gothic for buildings in 19th century Baltimore really had a lot to do with the religious ideas of the people who were raising the money and commissioning the building, getting it designed."
The Franklin Street Presbyterian Church, St. Alphonse Church, St. Mary's Seminary Chapel, the Episcopal Cathedral, and the New Deliverance Church are many examples within the city that allow historians as well as others to understand why and how these revival religious institutions were born into the city. Another example would be to look within our institution, as Towson University also has Gothic construction. Who is responsible for the Gothic arch and the Gothic movement that still lives on today? Dr. DeVries seemed to be reflecting on the same notion.
I always say one of the most amazing, one of the most curious mysteries, and you know, it's not Sherlock Holmes type mystery, but mysteries is, who is it who comes up with the Gothic arch? It is so unique. It's not in the Roman world, not in the Greek world. We don't have any other examples of it. It's not in Islam, not in China. It is a European structure, and we have no idea who came up with it. And I always have this vision that it was probably some young, bushy-tailed architect coming through, and he says to the old architect, "I think I've got a new idea." And the old architect poo-poos him as usually, "Oh, you young buck, you don't know anything." And then, sure enough, that's the Gothic cathedral.
Even though Abbot Suger claimed to be the father of Gothic architecture after funding the first Gothic church in France, architecture historians are not of that opinion. Many agree that he was self-promoting and took advantage of the fact that many architects, masons, and engineers of that time were numerate, but not necessarily literate. Gothic architecture is a unique and interesting style that made its way over to the New World, reborn as Gothic Revivalism that can be seen in our city today. Interwoven with brick blocks and concrete sidewalks, they stand out on our streets, deserving to be preserved for their history, their rareness, and their unrivaled importance to the city.